Dearly beloved, we are gathered here today to get through this thing called an interview with James Campion about his new book, Revolution, Prince, the Band, the Era. So, James Campion. There are a lot of Prince books on the market today. If someone had read through all of the Prince books on the market, why should they read yours? What new information does it bring to the table?
Well, thank you, Sydney. Thank you, first of all, for doing this. Thank you to my friend Jordan for shooting it. And that's a great question to start off because you are the audience I'm writing for this book. My motivation to write this, I'll talk about the motivation and then we'll get to why it might be different. I wrote this book because the older I get and the more time is separated from when I was a kid or a young man in my 20s in the 1980s, the less people remember the impact of that period. And I find that there's so many people who know. I asked about 2 or 3 people around your age today, a little older, about Prince. And they're like, oh, the singer? Oh, that guy, yeah, I know some of the songs. But they don't realize the impact, the cultural, the social, just the huge pop culture dominance of Prince during the 80s, specifically during the period of the film Purple Rain, wherein people do know Elvis Presley, they know the Beatles. And in 1984, Prince had the #1 film, the #1 song, and the #1 album in the world. That only happened with the Beatles and Elvis. So I believe that he deserves that type of attention. I think the difference between this book maybe and other books is I wrote it in a novel style. I want it to flow chronologically, but also emotionally, so you can feel what Prince was going through during those times. I used a lot of research, did interviews, but mostly I tried to mine my experience of listening to that music and put it into this book. But also I felt very strongly that it should point out how imperative and how completely motivating Prince's work, his collaborative work with other musicians was. And I think that's missing in a lot of the Prince stories. Yes, they talk about the Revolution because they were famous, they were in the movie. They were his most famous band, and certainly he was at his biggest height in the period I'm writing about, from 1979 to 1986. But he had other great bands, and I saw many of them live, and it was, just as good, if not better, in different ways. But I think there was something about this period in which Prince was really searching for that group, for that collaborative group. And in the book, as you know, because you read it, the band is family, family is the band. Because Prince had a very tough childhood, and then he really created his own family later on, speaking through music, his greatest language. So I think I read a lot of the Prince books you might be citing here. 2 people who were huge in helping me. Dwayne Tudall, first of all, who wrote 2 brilliant books about Prince's sessions from the early 80s. And Andrea Swenson, who did the official Prince podcast for years and has written the quintessential book about the history of music in Minneapolis. So they were big contributors to my research in this book as well. So I think compiling all of that and having this whole period being covered in a novelistic style, I think makes it a little different than the other Prince books out there.
It's very interesting, and I have not read all the other Prince books on the market, but I have listened to the official Prince podcast. And what's interesting about that is they interview a lot of the members of the Revolution and some of his other bands. And it gives this idea that obviously Prince tragically passed away, but even before then, he was a mystery and it was really hard to get to know him as a person. So getting to know the members of the Revolution, the members of his close circle who collaborated with him musically, is a way to get into his mind because they were, in a way, extensions of him. Do you agree with that?
Yes, and thank you for saying that because that's what I put in the book. When Prince created the first bands, I call all the bands Revolution because he was obsessed, as Brown Mark, his bass player, said, with the concept of revolution. Revolution into intergender politics, racial politics, sexual, certainly, politics, just politics. And he created this group that reflected that in fashion, in comportment, in attitude. And he wanted those people to reflect him. And he believed in the loyalty of that. And that's why he recruited a lot of these people, almost all of them as teenagers, 18, 19, just 20 years old. Because he was 18, 19, 20 years old. And he was trying to build this movement that he called Uptown. So the first part of the book is called Uptown Rising, based on his song from Dirty Mind, in which he basically lays out his manifesto, his philosophy in sexual politics, in racial politics, intergender, all the stuff I talk about. It's not so easy to do that as a singular entity, as a solitary entity, as I talk about in the book, where he created a lot of his music, played all the instruments, arranged, produced, written by Prince. But the band reflected that. As early as Dirty Mind, he has photograph of a band in there, even though 95% of that, 99% of that album is just him. But he wanted the band, and they went on stage, and that album didn't sell, but it sold because he went on stage and he made it live. He could only do that with the band, with women, with white musicians, black musicians, and these fusions of styles, rock, jazz, funk, pop, disco, all of that, and they embodied all of it. And it is amazing that he got these musicians, because he was such a great musician himself, he got them to buy in completely. I call it all in the book, and I put it in italics for a reason, because they were all in. And if they weren't, for a second, he'd let them know about it. And all those long jams and all the things that they did together. So yes, very much so. They reflected his philosophy, his sexual politics, his racial ideas about intergender and interracial harmony and power, the power of we, as again I talk about in the book. And that's the beauty of Revolution. It's more about all of it encompassing, not just the music, but of course the music is the forefront of all of that.
So I want to take it back to the earlier chapters where you kind of set the stage for his future relationships. So you talk about his rough childhood and his early musical pursuits, and these are somewhat of a window into the patterns that will follow him throughout his life. Patterns of restlessness, an insatiable need for creative control, and a potent fear of abandonment. Can you talk a little bit more about how these patterns first begin in Prince's life?
Yeah, so as I mentioned earlier briefly, and I go into it in the book, Prince, his childhood was very difficult. Both his parents were completely opposite people in almost every way. It's amazing. His mom was completely free and open. He talks about his earlier proclivities towards sexuality because his mother left, he believed, and she denied this, that she left sort of salacious material around the house when he was younger. She was very, very free and open, laughed a lot. She could drink to excess, but there was something free and open about her. His dad was extremely, extremely religious in the Seventh-day Adventist church, talking about the end times and a certain sort of stoicism that he imparted on him. And also, as a musician, his father was a jazz musician and a brilliant piano player, and instilled in him this incredible sacred worship of the piano and how important it was. Wouldn't even let him go near it until he can master it. So all of that is inside Prince. Of course, I make the joke, but it's really not. He's a Gemini, you know. So he has those two personalities. And I think what brings that together is meeting other like-minded people. When he meets Andre Anderson, who later became Andre Simone and was one of the first people to play in his first bands, and then joined his first touring band, there was a kindred spirit there, somebody who listened to the same music he did, that played different instruments, that even though he was from a larger family, a more loving family, and they ended up staying with him when his parents got divorced and his father threw him out. And I go into detail on that, but without getting too much in here, he clung to that. So that was his first sort of life raft, that basement connection to Andre, living at the Andersons' house. And that's his first bands, you know. And his first connection to music and what it meant to him, that saving grace of music. Speaking for him, he was so shy as a kid, through his whole life, but especially as a kid. Most kids are, I think. And, you know, as a black kid growing up in Minneapolis, which is about 82% Caucasian, there was a lot of that involved, the busing issue in the 1960s. So Prince had to, and he was a small kid, so like me, he got picked on a lot when he was a kid, and very insular. But the one thing he could always communicate is music. So he needed to find other people that find your tribe. You know, I said to you as a young singer-songwriter, one day you might not find those people in grammar school or middle school or high school, but you'll find those people eventually because you're an artist. And he knew he was an artist at a very young age, which is really quite miraculous that he was able to see, this is what I'm good at, this is what's going to save me and complete me, and I need to find these people to complete that aspect of me. So it's pretty cool.
Yeah, it is. And throughout reading the book, I really was so impressed by although he's Gemini, he's double-sided. What was never double-sided was his commitment to just going after the vision that he had. And whether that meant going after his own album or even prolifically writing for many other bands.
Sure.
He just never stopped. His vision was never ending. So I want to talk a little bit more about these other bands that he wrote for. So during the Revolution era and beyond, he continued writing for these other bands such as The Time and Vanity 6. Can you talk a little bit more about these projects and what brought them on?
Well, just like the Revolution or the early bands were a reflection, and I should mention also the names of his parents, Maddie, his mom, and John, his father, John L. as he called him. But I also should mention the people that were in the Revolution. And, I was able to try to bring in their personalities and how they formed off of him. So you had, Lisa Coleman was the first Gail Chapman, who I spoke to for the book, she was the first woman after his initial bands that joined his professional band. And it gave him this idea of having a female keyboardist. But Lisa Coleman was as good a musician as Prince. Couldn't play all the instruments, but on piano, an incredible musician. And she understood classical music and jazz and brought that into his oeuvre. And then you had Bobby Z, the young drummer, and being a white drummer in a black guy's band, as many black drummers will tell you, that's another level. Like Questlove will say, hey, you better have your stuff down if you're going to be playing in a funk band, play all these different styles. Bobby Z brought up kind of a real hardcore support to him. And then, of course, Matt Fink was, just loved all the different sounds and all the different bands that Prince loved. He brought that kind of connection. And then you have Des Dickerson, who understood the idea of Prince wanted to do the Mick Jagger, Keith Richards thing, where he can lean on the guitar player and they can trade off as a sort of, and I mentioned about Andre Simone. So that wasn't enough for Prince. He wanted to expand that. So he built The Time out of the Flight Time, which was another Minneapolis band. I should say, except for Lisa Coleman, who came from L.A., and later on Wendy Melvoin, who I mentioned, who ended up replacing Des from L.A., everybody else was from Minneapolis. So all these people understood the Minneapolis thing, which was very important to Prince. He often said, whatever's going on in the big cities like LA and New York, they're already moving on to stuff. We're taking the stuff that they had and we're melding it and building new things out of it. And you hear a lot of the late 60s, early 70s stuff in Prince's late 70s, early 80s stuff, and you hear a lot of the 60s, 70s stuff in his mid 80s stuff. So you can see Minneapolis might be dragging along the pop culture, but it's also introducing the great things about that through the Prince prism. So you see that with The Time. Flight Time was a big band in Minneapolis, and Jimmy Jam and Terry Lewis were big. They were known quantities. So Prince bringing that in, and of course Morris Day, who he made a star, was also in his original bands. So he needed that, and then he wanted a female band, so he brought in Vanity, and he built Vanity 6, and he wanted more of a rock band, so he saw that in Maserati. He wanted a band that represented sort of the jazz fusion thing he was going through in the mid-'80s, so he built The Family, and in each one, he expected them to be extensions of him. Getting back to my original point, and what I cover in the book a lot, Prince didn't just make music. He made myths. And in order to make those myths come alive, he needed people to represent those. And they all had their point in it. Vanity had her point in being the sexy sort of woman that is in a lot of his songs, like Little Red Corvette or Delirious or, When You Were Mine, this sort of femme fatale. So when she sings in his voice, because he's writing the songs, she's She's the tough girl that's like, I don't know, you're not quite satisfying me, right? But with Morris Day, that's the macho side of Prince. He's talking about, getting digits and hanging out at the clubs, and he's got the look, and he's braggadocio. Prince was able to break all of these personalities into these fully scoped acts. And in 1982, he took that on the road for the 1999 tour and called it the Triple Threat Tour. It was a triple threat in reality, but it was a triple threat of everything that Prince did well. To the point where he's sitting behind a curtain and some days playing the bass behind Vanity 6, and he's hanging out with the Time and giving them new tips and training them and working with the Revolution. I think it's just a fabulous story of a guy completely possessed by he was a solitary entity creatively, but he never wanted to be alone when it came to sharing sharing his music and experimenting and collaborating with people. That completed Prince as an artist for me. That's what I discovered writing this book.
Yes, and I feel like I discovered that by reading it. Speaking of him collaborating with other people, you mentioned before the all-in edict, this all-in attitude from people he collaborated with was needed in order to build the myth. Because if they didn't buy into the myth, then it wouldn't be as potent as he wanted it to be.
Sure.
Now, this is arguably what allowed the key members of the Revolution, like Lisa, Wendy, Brown Mark, and Matt Fink, and Bobby Z, to put on such an amazing show, especially during that Purple Rain period where they were just on fire. But there were also some downsides to this extreme level of intensity, which drove some people to leave the band. So why do you think some people like Andre Simone, Gail Chapman, and Des Dickerson left the band? And I know they have their different reasons.
Right.
But also, what was Prince's response to them leaving the band?
When Prince died and the Revolution had to get back together, I find that was one of the impetuses for me writing this book. Was I read the story in 2016 about how the band, the first thing they thought of was each other. I got to call Matt. I got to call Wendy. I got to call Lisa. I got to call Bobby. I got to call, Mark. And it ran deep with all of them. You know why? Because they survived it. Those people made it. I'm not saying that Des Dickerson gave his blood to the early days. Absolute blood. He was a huge part of this story, and I made sure he was. So was Gail Chapman. So was Andre Simone. But they left, as you mentioned, for their own reasons. But it was difficult. He demanded so much from them. 6-7 hour jams to build up music. Show up at 2 o'clock at a gig. Play till they open the doors. Eventually security is like, you got to get off the stage because we're letting people in. And then play a whole show, run back to the hotel, shower, and then ask everybody to come back to the stage to either record or work on a song, or go to an after hours club and play for another 3 hours. A bunch of songs that they just barely knew. He would just yell out. The demand to be around Prince was immense. It's the same feeling, and I'm not saying this flippantly. It was the same feeling that people had being in the army. It's like there's something in them. They made it through this incredible boot camp of being with Prince, and it meant something to them. And they all said that over the years, after it was all over, they would get calls at 2 a.m. from Prince, or they would see him. And they tell these just great stories about just seeing him later on. And they would make jokes. Remember we used to go out shopping for clothes? Remember we used to go to this hamburger place? They knew him, the him that he wouldn't allow people, because he created that whole myth of Prince. So they knew his sense of humor. That comes out in the songs, but really came out when they were on airplanes or in the back of the van, or they were, in the back of First Avenue getting ready for a big gig. So there's something about that, I think, that really bound that last Revolution together that they remembered after he passed. Not that the other people didn't, and I have great quotes of what they felt after Prince died, Des and Andre and Gail, but everybody had the different reasons, but in the end, it's just difficult to be around someone that it's that manic. I call it restless, but prolific and myopic at times, but completely focused into his art. And as I mentioned many times, and I have to state that if nothing else anybody gets out of this book, what these people, what these musicians meant to the music that you love. Even if it was a solitary entity like When Doves Cry, or When You Were Mine, or later on. But there was many, many times that out of jams came interesting bass lines or interesting little keyboard parts or interesting little harmonies. And those people were a big part of it. So it was through that great prism of Prince, as I mentioned before, that, I'm shocked. I mean, you read it. Were you shocked that people hung in there as long as they did with all that he went through? I mean, you're talking about you couldn't drink, you couldn't smoke, you couldn't not wear your full regalia out in public all the time. You had to show up early, like I said, to these gigs. You had to go to late night gigs. There was none of, I mean, for Wendy and Lisa, they didn't really have a life. They had to live in an apartment. I saw the apartment building that was close to where his warehouse was, where they used to rehearse. They just didn't have a life. And that was really the end of the revolution, because Wendy and Lisa were like, we need more money or something. And Prince took it because band is family, family is the band. Hey, we love each other. I'm take care of you. I'll always be here. You said you'd always be here for me. Like he felt his parents weren't. There's a lot of subtext in psychology. I play a little junior psychiatry in this, psychologist in this, but I think, which I do with all my books. I've said this about Hey Jude, and I've said this about the relationship the Kiss had, and I certainly said it about all the Warren Zevon stuff in my Zevon book. And that was an easy one, because he wore his heart on his sleeve, so to speak. Prince, not so much. He put it in his songs, but there was something about that shield. But when he's around these people, he let loose. It's so funny. No matter how many interviews I've done about, say, Warren Zevon or different, same thing with Prince. There's this amazing, that bastard, and I loved him like a brother. How do you, it's amazing. But they all, listen, if you had a chance to be around someone of that level of genius, and I know that word gets thrown around a lot, but this is a guy that I believe was truly a genius and plugged into the zeitgeist. Prince was like the Beatles in this sense. He created music that was revolutionary, experimental, and exploratory, but it was pop hits. It wasn't like he was Frank Zappa, or he was Yes, or some progressive rock band, or underground band. Yeah, he was all those things. But he had number one hits. He had number one movie. He was a big pop star. But yet he still entertained us all with incredible experimentation. So when I throw around genius in this interview and in other future ones, I truly do mean that in this case. Yeah.
I think he earns it.
Yeah.
It's true. And you mentioned before how one big point of this book is to let the reader delve into the songs and how the revolution contributed to the songs.
Sure.
Like maybe a song came out of a jam session, or maybe Wendy wrote this part and you didn't know that before. So I have to say, reading about the songs was one of my favorite parts of the book. And
thank you.
I wanted to know, how did you go about writing about these songs? Did you just play them on a loop, or did you conjure them from your memory?
Thank you for saying that. Some of the early reviews I've got, people have really dug that, and I'm glad. That's the greatest compliment you can give a music writer, because the old joke, and I say this all the time, I always attribute it to Elvis Costello, but I know Ray Charles made this joke, that writing about music is like dancing to architecture. So it's really hard to do. Music is meant to be visceral. It's meant to be aural, A-U-R-A-L. So you have a responsibility to describe the songs as best you can. How I did that, to answer your question, is twofold. The first thing I did was I immediately wrote the song how I remembered it. It's just like a story or a movie. How I remember it is different than when I just saw it. You and I just watched Jaws recently, and I saw things in there that I completely forgot. Like if I was telling you about it, I'd be like, oh, right. So I went and listened to the songs again. And then occasionally I would pause it and listen to it over and over again and say, how could I describe this? Because it's important that the reader knows that this is the key element. Like Prince taking the bass out of When Doves Cry. Prince recording, the entire Dirty Mind in his own studio at home. Prince taking what Maserati and Brown Mark did, and David Z, with Kiss, and massaging it in a quick hour in the studio and making a number one song, Kiss. So I wanted people to understand that. So yes, but the main thing I wanted to say is that I did it from memory first because I love these songs. But it's funny, when I did describe it, it was different than how I described the performances. The performances, I found YouTube videos, or I found old films, and I found in the archives, in Minneapolis archives, I found old appearances by Prince in concerts. So I described those by watching them. But with the music, I did it from memory, sense memory, and visceral memory, but I also did it from listening to the songs over and over and over again. And as all my books, I'm sorry to my wife and my daughter for listening. I love them. My wife's a huge Prince fan, but the other books drove her nuts. So just because I'm listening to it over, and I hate to listen to it with headphones all the time. I like to listen to it with the room sound. So it can be a bit much. But thank you for noticing that, because you're a songwriter, you're an artist yourself, and you're a communicator through music. So if you appreciate that, in a sense, it's like a little bit of Prince might appreciate that. So thanks.
Yes, and I think the future readers, current readers of this book will definitely appreciate it. I recommend having a radio nearby, having your Bluetooth speaker nearby while you read it, because I know I had to jump to my speaker every time I heard a song described because I needed to hear it immediately.
That's a huge one too. Thank you. That's what you do. As my job, how I see it, and I have many colleagues and friends and music journalists who all say the same thing. What we're trying to do is we're trying to get people just as excited that we are about the subject. And with music, the first thing you want to do is get people to listen to it. Get them back. If they were Prince fans in the 80s and they forgot, they're new Prince fans like yourself, and I hope a lot of readers are, and they're saying, oh, goodness, I can't believe it. I can't believe how big those records were. I can't believe that Prince did that at the Grammys, or he did that at the American Music Awards, that he was able to change the whole concept of race on MTV and bring black music and white music and rock music and disco music and Latin music and jazz music all into a soup and put it on the radio and break down all the barriers that were put up in the late 70s, mid 70s with this is disco, this is rock, never the twain shall meet. Black music had its own categories in award shows. It had its own radio stations. It had its own clubs. Same with white or rock music or punk music or new wave music. And Prince didn't want any of that. Not because he didn't celebrate his black heritage. He absolutely did. But he also did not want to be pigeonholed. He wanted to break free and do that. And I think it's in the music. And the only way that I'm succeeding as a writer, as a junior historian, in a sense, is to take you there, to take you into the music, and hopefully you go, oh, I got to listen to this. So thank you. That's a big deal. Yeah, especially, again, as a songwriter and someone who plays music and someone who listens to different music and also covers a lot of music. Because I should ask you, when you're playing other music, you tend to think of the songwriter, right? You think of, oh, that's a choice they made. That's a cool choice. Maybe I'll think of that. And if, as a writer, and not as a musician to your level, to bring that out is the goal. So.
Yeah, I mean, definitely everything I'm listening to is inspiring, and this book got me into a Prince rabbit hole, so I've been listening to all of the Prince albums, and while I do not write funk music, I feel like I'm taking on a little bit of Prince spirit, if not in my writing, in my life, and that sounds really cheesy, but
no, I mean,
he's a go-getter.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, that there's a focus and a workmanship and a true old world sort of spirit that he had. If you're going to be good at something, be really, really, really good at it. If you're going to try this, do it. Don't try it. He hated the word experiment. I use it, but I said at the very beginning, sorry, Prince hated it. Because he said experiment means you're not fully baked. You're not ready yet. I think exploratory is better. He saw himself as an oral, again, A-U-R-A-L pilgrim. Somebody who went out to different places and brought back that music. And again, I can't stress this enough. The period of time that Prince blew up, from 1979 specifically to 84, everybody gives a lot of props, and it's rightfully so, to Michael Jackson. But Prince was there first in the underground. Prince got Rolling Stone and the Village Voice and everything to love Dirty Mind in 1980. Michael Jackson made his comeback in 81, 82, and then blew up at the end of 82 and 83 with Thriller. Michael Jackson and Columbia Records absolutely pushed MTV to stop playing just white music. But Prince got 1999 and Little Red Corvette, which I think are two of the most important records certainly the most imitated records of the 1980s on the radio, the crossover radio. At least that I heard it. And certainly on MTV. It would never, ever, ever have happened. I give them equal props on that. But Prince was playing, this was not when Michael Jackson was already a big star in the 60s. So when Michael Jackson made comebacks, Michael Jackson wasn't playing clubs. He wasn't playing the Ritz. He wasn't playing the Roxy in LA. He wasn't playing the Bottom Line in New York City. He wasn't playing these clubs in Cleveland and Detroit. Prince was out there with a band kicking ass. I call them like this proto-punk gang. And they were out there kicking it. And they sold Dirty Mind, an album that nobody would play on the radio because it had subjects of, incest and homosexuality and bisexuality and every kind of sadomasochism. It's all in there. And so these radio stations didn't know what the hell to do with this guy. But the band drove it home. So he changed, in my estimation. I try to bring that across in Revolution. There was a revolution in racial and stylistic music. But he wasn't just doing it to raise the black man or to make equality. No. He was doing it because he felt it needed to be done because that's what he felt was coming out of him. It was very natural. And so through that, he did raise all the music that came after it. All of it, in my estimation, in the 80s and into the 90s, including hip-hop, which he didn't embrace right away. But I think, and I named some of the artists, and many of them, revered him, and rightfully so, because he broke a lot of color lines during a time. It seems odd to say that now, but that was the case. When I was in high school, especially in the early 80s, it was a complete break. That was two silos, and Prince changed that.
Yes.
And by putting black and white players in a band, playing every kind of music. And women who had a strong voice, who gave him a way to add strings and bring in music he didn't care about at first. And make it part of his, Indian raga music and reggaeton music and classical music. All of this stuff. Wendy and Lisa were a huge part of that. And they were women. Women playing guitars and pianos in rock bands. Very, very, there was like the Pretenders, the Go-Go's, the Bangles, and the Revolution. I'm serious. I'm missing a few people, I'm sure, a lot of solo acts, certainly. But having that kind of camaraderie, Wendy said it, me and Prince side by side doing the rock and roll thing. Girls weren't doing that. They just were not.
Yes, he was setting standards for the industry, and he was arguably credited with at least greatly influencing the Minneapolis sound, but some people argue that he invented the Minneapolis.
Or is this Minneapolis sound?
Or he is. What do you think on that?
Well, I used to think that. I used to make that joke. The Minneapolis sound is Prince, because Prince made that sound up, right? And then he played all the music on the Time record and Vanity 6, and they're like, all these cool bands coming out of Minneapolis. It was all Prince, right? But Andrea Swenson, set me straight. Her book, was a fantastic introduction to me about how far that goes back. These black bands playing in black neighborhoods during the redlining period, where you couldn't build neighborhoods that were interracial, and they were busing during the 60s, and there was a lot of racism going on in Minneapolis, and systemic racism. And Prince battled through that, and a lot of bands had to battle through that. But they also had to play for white audiences because, again, 8 out of 10 people in Minneapolis are white. If you want to make money and you want to have people in your club, there are going to be some white people in there. And so there was that kind of thing. That's part of the Minneapolis sound, fusing rock music with funk music, with disco music, with pop music. Then there was the great one, which I love, with Andre Anderson, or a.k.a. Andre Simone, told many interviewers, and I talked to his wife as well, about the idea of using keyboards because they all loved horns. The horns that you heard in Earth, Wind & Fire, or Chicago, or Stevie Wonder. The keyboards, they use keyboards to make that horn sound. That horn keyboard sound you hear on 1999, you hear it a lot of in the Purple Rain record, that all came from the early 70s band sounds in Minneapolis. And that is a big part of the Minneapolis sound. So Andrea taught me, and I came to learn through a lot of research in Minneapolis. Andrea introduced me to the people in the archives of Minneapolis. I spent days there going through all the articles, not just about Prince, but about all the bands, and they broke ground. And a lot of music. That's why I say I think 1999 is the most imitated record, except for the first Madonna record, I believe, in the 1980s. across the board. There were a lot of imitation records for electronica music and for funk music and heavy metal music. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking across the board popular music that infused itself into everything that was on the radio and MTV because of Prince's use of keyboards as horns, and everybody started doing that. So that is the Minneapolis sound. But it gets nowhere without Prince Rogers Nelson making it, for sure, you know.
So, long story short, he didn't invent it, but he heavily influenced it.
Yeah. Somebody has to bring it to the masses, for lack of a better term.
Yeah.
So, yes, I would say
popularized.
he popularized it for sure. But as soon as it became popular, he abandoned it. So
Never mind, I'm done with this.
Yeah. So when Purple Rain blew up, he abandoned that, and then when Around the World came out, he abandoned it. Well, you know. So anyway.
So speaking of abandoning projects or moving on to different sounds, after the Purple Rain tour, it seemed like Prince had tired of his high-octane, sensationalized touring, and he even tried to take a vacation from music in Brazil. And this so-called vacation did not last very long because he got bored. He is, as you put it many times in the book, restless.
Yes.
But when he returned to music, his attitude was different. Do you think Prince was unprepared for this level of fame? And how did the overwhelm of being a worldwide sensation affect him in his future projects?
The thing I found fascinating about Prince is he wanted to be a star. That's it. And I feel that way about everybody. I wrote about this in the Kiss book. Everybody gives Kiss crap for putting makeup on and putting on shows and personas. And I said, well, what about Elvis? He was a persona. And it changed his persona. He was this boogie-woogie country boy. And then he was the black-haired, like movie star. And then he was the Vegas sequence jumpsuit guy. The Beatles were the Fab Four with the matching suits, and then they were the psychedelic guys with the mustache and the granny glasses, and then they were the hippies with the jeans. Bob Dylan, all of a sudden he's Woody Guthrie, all of a sudden he's a speed-chewing Mercury Sound hipster, and then he's out in Woodstock with his sandals, and he's playing with the band, and now he's found Jesus. Everybody goes through these periods, right? Prince understood this. He created this myth and the mysticism of rock, of popular artists, and not just music artists, movie stars. He was completely influenced by film. And 1920s film, 30s, 40s, he was steeped in that. He understood the concept of being a star. So he wanted to be a star from the very beginning. He becomes one of the biggest stars. In 1984, he's the biggest star on the planet. I mean, Michael Jackson's still there, but Michael Jackson had his year. Bruce Springsteen's coming. So is Madonna. And there's others. In 1984, that's the other thing. Replete with not only bands making comebacks, like Tina Turner or The Police are huge there, that were big in the 70s or 60s. Genesis being big. Phil Collins, who's a 60s, 70s progressive band, being huge. But you have Huey Lewis in the News. You have Here Comes Madonna. Here comes Cyndi Lauper. Here comes huge. That went on for another 50 years. So Prince is right in the middle of that, right? And he's the biggest star of all of them. But I think what happened with him is he saw it as a game. And then when the game left his control, because he was a control freak, which was a relationship with all the band and everything, he rejected that immediately. And the one thing that I think I pointed out in the book, and thanks again to Dwayne Tudor for pointing out all the things that Prince did during that period from 83 to 85, Prince did everything he could do immediately to extricate himself from stardom. Everything. Before Purple Rain came out, he was already making new music. He almost recorded the entire Around the World in a day by that point. He wanted a new haircut. He wanted a new, completely different design for his clothing and the band's costumes. But then he had to go on the road. And he had to do this thing that he'd left behind in 1983, 84, all the way through 85. By 3 shows into the massive Purple Rain tour, which he is the biggest thing on the planet, he can't bear it, and he starts to lose it. And he said, then he has a bad night, and he's just like, Then he starts bringing in other musicians. He starts bringing in horns. He starts doing long jams. He starts doing more after-hour shows so he can jam new music, so he can get it out of his head. He's running to the studio after gigs, running back to Minneapolis to record with all of his completely exhausted engineers, and he's driving the band to try new things. So They were just enjoying being stars. They were enjoying being stars, the band. After 1999, they exhaled. And then he went back to his management and said, okay, here's what's going to happen. We're going to make a movie. And it's not going to be a cheap exploitation rock movie like I've been watching my whole life. It's not going to be produced by some small-time thing. It's going to be produced by Warner Brothers, who's my record company. I'm going to be the lead on the top of the movie poster. We're not going to film this thing in Hollywood. We're going to film it in Minneapolis, and it's going to be the biggest movie ever. When people were just like, can't we just exhale here about 1999 and this great tour we went, the Triple Threat? No, he was 6 steps ahead all the time. So, of course, when everybody was like, yeah, we're stars with Purple Rain, we're finally making some scratch, we're getting we're playing in front of 30,000 people in stadiums, he's like, I don't want to do this anymore. I want to do psychedelic raga music. And back to the point that you were asking before, how do people hang in there? Or why did they quit? It was tough. And then, with about 2 weeks left in the tour, I might have this wrong now because it's been a while since I read my own manuscript. About 2 weeks left in the tour, he tells everybody, I'm done. I am going to go look for the ladder. He writes the ladder. And then when they ask him why, he says, well, sometimes it snows in April. These people have been on crappy buses in shitty hotel rooms with this guy, playing every type of club to some shock, because they're all wearing garters and he's wearing panties and they're singing songs about incest and sadomasochism, and they're playing in front of white, black audiences. They finally get over the hump and he's like, yeah, I'm done. And they had to live with that. And then he comes back, as you said, bored, ready to go again, and he's in a completely different mindset. Prince was building a revolution, and the revolution was that band. Before they were called the Revolution, and even after the revolution was gone, all those bands that came afterwards, as Bobby says, Bobby Aziz is quoted in my book, they had it just a little easier because we warmed them up or we softened them a tad. I think all those bands would argue against that. But they watched him grow from, as Bobby Z always said, not very famous to very famous. But once Prince got there, because he's a control freak, and my friend Adam Duritz, who I did a podcast for years, he said, fame isn't something that happens, it happens to you. You're the same, but the way people react to you is different. And that was already a tough pill to swallow for Prince Rogers Nelson. He didn't like people judging him. He wasn't black, he wasn't white, he wasn't straight, he wasn't gay, he wasn't female, he wasn't male. He wasn't a rock musician, he wasn't a jazz musician, he wasn't a funk musician. Don't make me black is what he told Warner Brothers. So if you tell Prince what he is, and you start to say, he's the kid, he's the guy from Purple Rain with the pompadour hairdo and the open shirt and the jamming guitar, I want that guy every time for the next 20, 30, 40 years. And he's like, you're not getting this for the next 20, 40, 30 days. So, yeah. And that was why it's fun to write about, because he's out of his mind. He's brilliant, but can you imagine having to think about all of his lovers, which I talk about in the book very briefly. I don't get into his personal life, but all the people that were with him too, they couldn't fathom him. They couldn't understand they knew he was all about the music, but they couldn't fathom where he was coming from. He would do something totally terrible and write this gorgeous song and then completely be this loving person because of the Gemini thing, because of the John L. and the Maddie, the loving, sweet, fun-loving, but very irresponsible and wild Maddie, and the very strict, stoic, no-holds-barred, focused John. That was running through Prince all the time, and that's how he dealt with his personal and his professional relationships. And, sometimes when I was writing that book, I had to put down, just walk away from it for a few minutes and just exhale. I was like, wow, this guy's on fire all the time without being on drugs. The ironic thing is he died of, the prescribed medication, fentanyl, from all the injuries of dancing and jumping on high heels and pounding on those small legs and knees and hip replacements. So Prince had pain later in his life from that period, but never did drugs, and no one in the band did, but they were expected to play 10, 12 hours a day. And he never, ever stopped, and especially during that period. To write about that was exhausting. Yeah. Were you exhausted reading it?
Yeah, a little bit. I was like, do they at least drink coffee? Like, do they eat? Do they drink?
They did drink coffee. He loved coffee and chocolate. That was his vice.
Starfish and coffee,
yes,
perhaps?
Little starfish and coffee. Thank you. Very good. But yes, yeah, he did. He was a caffeine guy, and but they said also they didn't even know when the hell he slept. It's weird. I don't know. He's like a alien.
Some people genetically need less sleep. Maybe he was one of those.
Yeah.
He had to be, right?
Yeah. Yeah. He had to be. See, you're different. I liked how you said, I know you since you were little, and you said you slept because you were building up your brain.
I was saving up 12 hours. Man, if I slept 6 hours, maybe I'd be like Prince right now.
Manic and restless.
Maybe I'd be
Yeah, you don't want to be there.
rocking and rolling.
You're doing a fine job.
Thanks.
You're very welcome.
So he didn't sleep. He might not be of this world. He was a shapeshifter in many ways.
Yeah.
Shifting genres. As soon as he gets comfortable in one genre, as soon as the audience gets comfortable hearing him in one genre, he's like, bye. Right. On to the next. And after Purple Rain, we had Around the World in a Day, and then Parade for the Cherry Moon movie, which was not
well received
like Purple Rain. So after that disappointing movie, he decided to almost double Revolution, right? He added a bunch of new people, new instruments.
Yeah.
And do you think this expansion of the band caused the relationships with the original members to fray? Or was it merely a symptom of Prince trying to further isolate himself?
That's both. Very good. That's a great question. I do explore that a lot in the book, especially towards that period. Interestingly enough, as I said earlier, when Prince was on watch the American Bandstand performance, watch his midnight special, watch him on Saturday Night Live. The band, he absorbs himself into the band. They protect him, but they also lift him. Lisa Coleman said, we were his safety net. We were his elevator. We pushed him. And he pushed us. But they always had his back. That's the all-in thing. When we get to Parade and the tour when I saw him, and I saw the Revolution. I was actually at the last ever Revolution show in America because they played Madison Square Garden the 2nd and 3rd of 1986, and then he went to Europe and then Japan and then broke up the band. So I was able to be there for the last one, and that band was huge. It was a huge show band, a lot of jazz, a lot of horns, dancers. That dynamic did the opposite. It was like getting lost in a city. So many people, so many different things going. He was like James Brown in a way that he was separated. And that's what the band started to notice after 1999 and Purple Rain 2. It became so big. They used to be all on the same bus. Now he's on a different bus. They used to be in the same room or two rooms. Now he's in a different suite, which makes sense. He's a star and Warner Brothers has to meet with him and he has a lot of stuff going on. But there was a camaraderie that they broke. So building the band out, all the original members looked around and said, to a person, they all said it, and I quote them in the book, wait a minute, what's going on here? We finally got our shit together. We're finally tight as a drum. We're dominating on the road. Why do we need all these instruments? He needed it because it was going on in his head, like a Brian Wilson, like a Paul McCartney, like a Stevie Wonder. He had these sounds, so he built it out. And so, yes, being in the band is family, family is the band, absorbed him and gave him power, both in his messaging, like I said, intergender, interracial, social, open, all-inclusive kind of message. And when it got big, it got lost. He got lost in that. It became too big. I don't think so. I enjoyed the hell out of that period. And I think the band eventually, swallowed hard and did what they did. They just followed Prince because everything Prince did seemed to work. And so they follow along. But still, it was challenging, and I think that's an excellent question. He got lost in two ways, in an empowering way and also in a way that kept him at a distance. So at that point, it became easier to break up the band, which I was heartbroken when I wrote that chapter. I can only imagine as a reader when you're coming through, especially someone new like yourself who's reading for this first time. And I remember when it happened, and we were all shocked. But then when you read about how things were starting to there was friction and things were starting to fray, then you could kind of understand it. And that's what I tried to do in those chapters, to make you understand how we went from all in to what the hell happened. There's separation here. There's personality issues. There's money issues. There's, hey, I just want a life issues.
Yeah, I definitely saw it coming in the book. I mean, I knew that the revolution eventually broke up, but the way you wrote it like a novel, there were signs.
Thank you. Thank you.
Especially when the relationship between
Yeah.
him with Wendy and Lisa, who were so close to him, arguably the closest people to him.
Too close, as Bobby Z said.
Yeah.
Maybe. And they said that they wouldn't. After a while, they weren't playing the game that I told you about. That he saw fame as a game that he's playing and winning and creating on his own. And they saw the real side of him, and they knew how much he relied on them. And they were available to him 24 hours a day. That he'd call, no matter where they were, get to Europe, we have to finish this thing. Get to the studio in LA, we have to finish this track. Can you come up with some string parts for this thing we're recording in Minneapolis? It's a lot. It's a lot. And I love Wendy and Lisa's story. They were lovers, but they had to keep it quiet because those were the times. And plus, they didn't want to be seen as the gay couple. They wanted to be seen as the musicians in the revolution. And I give him a lot of credit for that. And just like Prince did not want to be black, gay, white, straight, whatever, white, he wanted to be seen as Prince. As Lenny Bruce once said, I'm not a comedian, I'm Lenny Bruce. What the hell does that mean? It means like don't come, you're not getting one-liners here, you're getting this. You come see a black artist, you don't expect, I'm going to do things you might not expect from a black artist in 1978, 79, 80, 81. Same thing with Wendy and Lisa. You're expecting a woman with a guitar, a woman with a keyboard, adding to the music. If all of a sudden they come out as a gay couple, it's like, oh, it's a shtick. It's a game. It's part of the thing. And Prince wanted that. Wendy tells that wonderful story about how the famous poster for the Purple Rain, inside the Purple Rain album, he made sure, Prince, that Wendy or Lisa put her arm around Wendy. They knew right then, oh, they're a couple, they're together. He was playing that game, but they didn't want to do that, to their credit. So I don't know where I was going with that, but I wanted to get that part in about Wendy and Lisa because they were a huge part of what he did. And as you said, with the Prince podcast that Andrea did, that was also an inspiration for me. Is that I was like, wow, that's so true. Even I thought Prince did all these things and they just went on the tours. They were in the trenches with him. They were in the studio. They recorded a lot of Purple Rain in that warehouse. They recorded Purple Rain live on August 3rd, 1983 at First Avenue. That whole story is magnificent. They were on stage while that 100,000 people were throwing bottles and M80s and food at them when they opened for the Rolling Stones. All those, well, Wendy wasn't there, but those people were right there beside him. It's a wonderful, wonderful story of camaraderie and just friendship and real true love bound by music, not by blood or by, nobody in the band slept with each other like Fleetwood Mac or anything like that. It was all really true to the music.
And that's why the revolution was so special. So on October 17th, 1986, the revolution was publicly and officially disbanded. Prince continued to release music with the New Power Generation and in other projects later.
Sure.
For decades until his tragic death in 2016, which broke my mother's heart.
She did. Your mom,
many
I should
other
say, your mother
friends.
Shannon, was the first person to text me. That's how I found out.
Yeah.
And then I got a text from my good friend Anthony, who was in my band at the time, and we were Prince nuts. We would listen to Prince songs over and over and over and over. And he was the guy who drove all the way from North Carolina, because my brother's birthday's on August 2nd, all the way up to Madison Square Garden on the 3rd to see the revolution. He wrote me maybe 10 minutes after that and wrote, wow. And then I got a deluge, and then I wrote the cover story for the eulogy for the Aquarian, because my deadline was the next day. He died on a Thursday. And that was also one of the inspirations for the book, too. I know this is not your question, but I wanted to say, but one of my inspirations for the book was when I wrote that, I realized when it was over, because it was just this regurgitation of the feelings I had about Prince and growing up with that music, that most of the memories were when I was in my 20s and in a band. And I thought, maybe I should write about this. Maybe I should tell that story as best I can. So, but yes, those two dates are, a big deal in Prince land, but certainly for the revolution. And like you said, it wasn't a shock to them, but it was in a way. And how he did it on stage in Japan, and then meeting with each one of them, it's heartbreaking. And just thinking about it now gives me chills. I hope people realize the utter love that these people had for having gone through that together. Not just for Prince, but for each other. The support that they give each other. When Bobby Z had his heart attack back in, I think in the early teens, or whenever it did, 2010 maybe, they had big charity events. They got back together to research for heart health, and Prince invited him up on stage to play Purple Rain with him, and Prince helped Wendy and Lisa with some of their records later on. And like I said, that connection never broke. And you could see it come out after he passed away, and they got back together, and they played for 2 years together. And Wendy would tell the crowd, you all sing this song. You're Uptown. She knew it. She knew what he meant by Uptown. Everybody. Prince was always looking for Uptown. What is that? That's his way of saying heaven, nirvana, everybody's equal, everybody's having fun. There's no hang-ups about sex. There's no hang-ups about race. There's no hang-ups about money and who doesn't have money, who's short, who's fat, who's tall, who's skinny, who's gay. It doesn't matter. And that was his Uptown. So when all these people came and were singing the songs back to them, and they were crying, weeping on stage, especially when they played First Avenue and they kept the light on the middle of the stage where he stood, and Wendy said, you're Uptown, take it. This is what he wanted. And I think that's true. Yeah. And it couldn't have been done without a band. Again, Michael Jackson, Madonna, they had cover bands, but he knew the worth of the Rolling Stones, Talking Heads, Sly and the Family Stone. He understood that idea of having that gang, that band, that family around him. Very important. And it led to I feel, his greatest period, which I cover in the book. Certainly his most prolific. He was never not prolific, but that period was insane. He had 3 offshoot bands. He's playing gigs. He's recording his own music. He's making movies. He's writing and recording songs. There's thousands of them that are in the vault that they still talk about to this day that they can release for the next 50 years or whatever the hell it is. A lot of that was recorded during that period, and it's just amazing.
It is amazing.
It is. Anyway, is that good? You got everything you want?
Yeah, before we wrap up,
yes,
I want to ask a personal question.
Sure.
So, first of all,
Am I straight or gay?
Before my personal question about
yes.
your race. No, I'm kidding.
And my sexual proclivities.
Before my personal question.
Oh, this shirt has
I just want to thank you for giving me the honor of being able to interview you. This is my first interview ever, and
can't tell, you were very good.
It's an honor to interview my amazing music writer uncle, who has been a mentor to me throughout my life.
And we should say that this is an incredible, talented, wonderful, strong, and very focused singer-songwriter woman, and I am so proud of you. And I wanted you to do this because nobody else wanted to do it, but also because you're right in my wheelhouse. I want people your age to go, wow, well, that was something else. What was going on then? And I also want Prince fans to enjoy this, certainly, and people who lived during that period. And a lot of people who are Prince fans wrote me or have reviewed the book already and said, it was so cool that this is all in one place. I could relive all of this again, But anyway, please keep the accolades coming.
Yes, accolades.
So what's the question?
So this book is adding to the series of your already amazing music books.
Sure.
So in the process of writing this book about Prince, I know you're already a huge Prince fan, but did you learn anything new that changed your idea of Prince as an entity?
Oh my goodness, yes. But number one, which I think is the real underlining theme and core of the book, or thesis for lack of a better term, is that a person that I thought completely was a solitary entity that recorded, and he did, played all the instruments and arranged and produced, was a control freak to the nth degree. The amount of people he allowed in, the amount of collaboration, as I said before, but also input, incredible input that he allowed all these people. I tell the incredible story of Claire Fisher, who did all the string work for Parade and On. He did string work for Prince, and I'm going to get this wrong because I didn't write about the time after the revolution, but I think he, all the way up until close to Prince's death, until his death, some 20 plus years, Prince never, ever was in the same room with him. Never met him, didn't want to meet him. In fact, one time, Claire Fisher's son told, I think one of his biographers, that he was standing at an award show about 4 feet from Prince with his father, and he almost introduced them, but then he went with Prince's wishes and didn't introduce them, so they never ever met. But it just goes to all these things I learned. I never thought he let that many people in. I never thought he was inspired so much by these people. And I am so glad that I did learn it, and I want people... Originally, this was just supposed to be about the revolution, but I think it's about a revolution. Like I said before, a musical, philosophical, spiritual, sexual, and political revolution. And they were at the forefront. They were his gang. Like I said, they represented him in every way. It's much more powerful, I think, coming from a band than a singular artist, I believe. And Dylan understood this too. He's the closest thing. They both came from Minneapolis. They both were shapeshifters. They both got bored of stuff as soon as they made it up. And they loved playing with bands. They love new bands, new sounds. When Dylan went electric, it's the same thing as Prince coming out and getting booed in front of the Rolling Stones. These are people trying things. Eventually, people catch up. And I think you do that much better in a gang or your tribe.
Well put.
Thank you. We're good?
I think we're good. I think we made it through this thing called An Interview with James Campion.
Well, thank you, Sydney Leigh. I really, really appreciate this. And thank you, Jordan, for enduring this heat and standing for the entire time. So that's it. Good. Peace.